We are so honored to be here with you and the entire Hilton Foundation family today. And I want to say good morning. I also want to say Balogum Hoyeche, which is I think how you say it in Bengali, because we're going to be honoring Bengali speakers today. And I want to thank everybody who is here for taking a moment to pause in a life that, if yours is like mine, seems like a giant run-on sentence. Moments where we don't have enough commas, enough periods, or even exclamation marks, no question marks. We have to look in our lives for these moments where we can pause, think, and dream of what we want to see in this world. And that's what today really is about. And I'm so honored to welcome back to the City of Angels this prize. Thank you, Peter and Maggie and everybody who worked on this year's presentation and bringing it home, I'd like to think. And we hope that you will keep it here home in a city that in many ways is not just a significant global city, but what I wanted to talk to everybody about this morning is a needed global city, a critical and crucial global city, one which is a reflection of the face of the world today, and in many ways the face of this nation tomorrow, a place that's constantly reimagining and rethinking industries, stories, pluralism, and yes, indeed, hopefully the moral obligations that we hold with one another. The Hilton name is synonymous with hospitality, and in many ways it's also what we talk about with the Hilton Foundation. How hospitable will we be to one another? How do we find connections as human beings across lines? And while today's theme is bridging the divide, it is really also about crossing the border. I say that very intentionally to provoke a little bit because I would say, first and foremost, my life has been as a border crosser. Both figuratively and literally, I was raised in a town where you can see the face of the world on the streets of Los Angeles. My father and mother, my father is here with us today, a beneficiary of the Hilton Foundation at times and somebody who's pushed as a UNESCO ambassador on water in this world, many humanitarian issues himself. They raised my sister and I in this town looking at that globalism locally and expecting to find localism globally. So just as I saw that face of the world on the streets of LA growing up here, raised by two parents who, I guess you could say, grew up on different sides of the track, two different cultures. My father, with an Italian last name, is actually Mexican-American predominantly. My mother is Jewish. If you can't get elected with that mix, good luck. But when people ask me, are you Latino, are you Jewish, are you Italian, I always say yes, because it's who I am. Then in Los Angeles, a place where we take things like Korean food and mash it up with Mexican food and create a short rib taco that people chase around and a truck throughout town that reinvents the culinary moment, we're used to these collisions, these border crossings. But in some ways, my story and the city's story starts further back than that. In my family, my father's father, Salvador, was born in a small town called Parral in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico, a place where Pancho Villa was killed during the Mexican Revolution, and we believe his grandfather, my great-grandfather, was also killed when my grandfather was just 1 year old. And my bisabuela, or great-grandmother, carried him over the border in her arms when he was just 1 year old. Something which has resonance now when I'm a leader and we debate what should we do with women who suddenly show up at the border of our country with children in their hands. She wasn't thinking about probably the laws of Mexico or Los Angeles. She was thinking about the survival of her child. When you see Rohingya who are crossing the borders between Burma and Bangladesh, I don't think there's a lot of time to review the legalities of things. We're talking about the humanity of it. And through that one simple act, that my family came here, on the Jewish side, fleeing pogroms and forced conscription for a lifetime in the Russian Empire to go fight in Japan, far away from home and never seeing families again. They fled the chaos of the moment and came to this place, which welcomes border crossers, which welcomes the idea that here we can figure out a way to really write the human history which is about collaboration and not about division. You see, to Peter's point earlier, we do have a very divided world today, a place in which we hear and think that really we are all different, and that difference causes us to be divided and to not know one another. Here in Los Angeles, that's not our experience at all. In fact, we don't just celebrate diversity, I would argue we have unity here. I remember when the mayor of Seoul came and visited me a couple years ago. He wanted to go to a Dodgers game and see this town. And go Dodgers, by the way. Great start to the playoffs. Had to get that in. And he said, I want to be more like Los Angeles. And I said, Mayor Park, why? And he said, we have been very successful in Seoul. We've been very successful in South Korea. The economic miracle of the last 30 years, our technology is in the hands and pockets of people. They drive our cars. And yet we know that if we don't become a more diverse city, we won't be globally competitive. And I thought this was so remarkable in a city where just 25 years ago, people were saying that our diversity would rip us apart. In the midst of the riots that came here to Los Angeles, the dominant threads that we saw, Time magazine talking about how California was going to break off into the ocean and how this foreign place out there on the left coast suddenly couldn't work. Within 25 years, in a breathtaking pace, was seen globally as our great strength. That this city, where 39 countries have their largest population outside their home country, where over 200 languages are spoken, where over 115 countries of origin, it is not just the most diverse city in the world today, but in human history. And with that comes the evidence of what works when we all work together, not just to understand our differences, but to find our common action. The Hilton Foundation is all about that, and I'm so pleased to be a partner with this foundation, whether it's on the work that we're doing with homeless veterans and employing veterans. We just surpassed our goal of hiring 10,000 veterans in the last 3 years here and connecting them with jobs a month ago. 10,500 we've done, and we're going to keep going. Whether it's the work to house every unhoused Angelino, whether it's the work to make sure that folks who are coming out of jail can find jobs instead of recommit crimes, this foundation is thinking about, as this city does, reinventing tomorrow. But after 20 years, it's natural for you to come back to a town that is both global, that is generous, and that is ingenious. Those three qualities define who we are. It was in this room about 2 years ago that I stood as Boston dropped out and Los Angeles stepped up to become the official United States city to bid for the Olympics, to bring the Olympics, the Summer Games, back for the first time in 30 years to America. And I said then that this is the kind of town where every athlete, no matter where she comes from, will find a home court advantage, because if she's Congolese, there's 20,000 Congolese that live here. If she's Guatemalan, this is the biggest Guatemalan city outside of Guatemala. If she's Mexican, this is actually the second largest city of people of Mexican descent, period. You have to go back to Mexico for number 3, and for Thais, and for Armenians, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a place that welcomes, a place that understands, and that is constantly rethinking about the future. The generosity of this city, as Steve mentioned, was shown in this year. People are all over the place about American politics right now, but that same night that we elected a new president, we passed 5 measures to invest in ourselves. In community college, which we've now made free in Los Angeles, the biggest city to do so. In parks and open space, to make sure that everybody has green space to walk to within her own neighborhood. In homelessness, not just once, but twice, the $4 billion that was mentioned, that gives us a fighting chance to end homelessness on the streets of LA. And also in transportation, the largest public transportation measure in the history of this country. And for those of you who are not familiar with California politics, you need 2/3 of people to vote for these measures to raise a tax. And we had 71%. As somebody joked the other day, people polled the popularity of mothers and they were slightly under that. So to get 71%, and I love my mother, it's a tough thing to do. But the ethics that my parents gave me, because they both met working at Pan Am Airlines, and they raised me to see the world. But we never went on vacations, we took trips. I went to China in 1983 when I was just 12 years old. They took me to the Olympics in 1984, which inspired me to want to bring it back for my daughter. We went to Rwanda, we went to Egypt, we went to India. We saw, and then they pushed me to work in those places. So in high school, between the 2 famines, I was doing medical relief work in Ethiopia, and then what would be Eritrea, where I came back later to live, to do my academic research, looking at their war of independence. Through the people that I met here, I was able to go to Burma and be with the then democratic resistance just after the crackdown post-elections in 1991 and 92 and 93, and work with folks, including Rohingya, so that today when I see what's happening on the border, I don't need to learn that. Growing up in Los Angeles, in some ways, was the connection to teach me about that. And when we look at Los Angeles, I remember when I first ran for city council, and I was at the time teaching international relations, and I had studied abroad and done work in different places in the world. People said, "Why are you running for local politics?" And my counter is always, "Have you seen Los Angeles? It is global politics." A district that I was running for and represented included Thai Town, Little Armenia. We designated historic Filipino town in Little Bangladesh shortly thereafter. It's a place where we celebrated the diversity and the unity that came from it, because we learned the lessons. It wasn't enough just to ask each other about our differences, your language and your food. We had to understand the common projects to get rid of gang violence or to build a park or to find ways to have more affordable housing, that those things bridge our communities and bridge our differences. I would offer that human history is not the history of division, as much as leaders would have us believe here today. Don't get me wrong, ethno-nationalism and tribalism is the easiest thing to motivate hate in our world. But when you think about the periods of prosperity and of growth of humanity, it has been when our cultures have mingled. It is the sharing of Asia and European knowledge together. It is the way that Africa and the Middle East and the Mediterranean was a fulcrum that produced from Muslim Spain, where multiple religions flourished together and run as a counter-narrative to some of the more religious nationalism that we see today. Humanity has been about those times when we come together. It is those who distort history and who come to write these sanitized histories that, for instance, in the Balkans say that Croats have always hated Serbs when in reality they intermarried for centuries, but to exploit that for their own power. We see the conflicts and the hatred. So we must be border crossers, and Los Angeles is that place where we can find that generosity that a Hilton Humanitarian Prize can call home. In this confusing moment when between technology and the search for truth, when the most fundamental things from journalism to global climate change to the things that we say are literally under attack and people say there is no truth or call things they disagree with fake news, it is important for us to run counter to that, to say there are still things that are the truth. There are still things that are good. And humanitarianism is at the heart of who we are. Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was helping to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, wrote, and I'll paraphrase this, "After all, where do human rights begin? In faraway places, in distant lands? No, they exist in places so small that they're not found in any human map. The places that we live, the places where we work, the places where we worship. That human rights there must mean something if they are to mean anything anywhere else." So today we celebrate both localism and globalism, the idea that humanitarianism begins right here, right now, in this place with us where we live. I'll remember on homelessness a story that moved me this past year that I wanted to share with you. I was in Chatsworth, which is in the San Fernando Valley, and we were helping move in 2 people who had been living on the streets. We have a welcome home project, which any of you who are Angelinos, I invite you to be a part of. Instead of a holiday party at your place of work, you can actually do a welcome home party where we put together kits for people who are moving in. It's tough enough to get people housing, but once they get housing, they only have an apartment and often don't have the sheets or the pillows or the soap and other things that turns it into a home. And so we were delivering one of these baskets that was put together in the valley to these 2 people, and I said, "Tell me your story." And the man said, "Well, I was born on a reservation in Arizona. I was drafted in Vietnam, and when I was in Vietnam, I was in a particular tough firefight. And in the foxhole next to me, I looked at my brother in arms and I said to him, to one of my fellow soldiers, 'If I don't make it out, will you promise me that you will raise my daughter? I've got a little daughter back home.' And of course he said yes. And thank God they both made it out of that firefight that day and they made it back home. But he said the demons of Vietnam haunted him. And while he didn't have a substance abuse problem or any of the other things that sometimes are challenges to folks that live on the streets, he said, I hit the streets and started living there, and he was there for more than a decade. And one day he met a younger woman who was on the streets, and they decided to kind of adopt each other. She decided that he would be her dad, and he would help as her father on the streets, as his daughter. And after a couple weeks living in tents next to each other and looking out for one another, he said, tell me your name again. And she mentioned her name. And he said to me, I stopped in my tracks because this was the daughter of the man that I had been in the foxhole with in Vietnam. And while I didn't need to fulfill that promise then, somehow God had brought us together at this moment. And I was fulfilling that promise because he had passed away. She told him of alcoholism, one of the things that led her to the streets, and somehow they were there to save each other. You see, behind humanitarianism, it's difficult because when we scale things up, we hear amazing statistics like 50 million lives saved. But that's 50 million individual stories of challenges, of crisis. The human mind can't take it in. The heart can't understand 500,000 refugees coming over the borders from Burma into Bangladesh. That in Lebanon, where there's 3 million native Lebanese, there's 1.5 million refugees living there right now. Imagine 150 million refugees in our country, and yet somehow they're trying to make that work. That there are more Syrians in Jordan now than Jordanians. That the moments that we're called to step up seem so overwhelming that we don't know where to begin. But it begins with you. It's what we've learned in this city. It begins with one family adopting one family coming off the street to end homelessness. It starts with one boss willing to hire somebody who's been convicted of a crime but has turned her life around. It starts with us speaking up and speaking out and making the connections that allow us to cross borders that we're not comfortable crossing ourselves. I want to congratulate ICDDR, B. And we're happy to have some Hollywood folks, rebrand the name if you want us. But it's a great name too, because we all have to learn it and it sticks with us. Because what you have done is to navigate the borders of health and of opportunity and of humanity. I was so moved to see the images in Bangladesh of folks completely disorganized, but completely lovingly embracing the Rohingya who are coming over the border. Human beings try to help before we know how to help. It shows that who we are and what rests in our hearts is more powerful than any other force of division, of walls that we erect, of borders that we try to close off. The human heart is the most powerful organ we have. It's more powerful than our mind or even our guts. And if we are able to continue to celebrate through the work of the Hilton Foundation, that on a block-by-block basis and on a country-by-country basis, on a continent-by-continent basis, we will feel our power. So the only words of inspiration I will leave you with is don't cede the power you have before you exercise it. At this moment when you might want to yell at the TV, and I tell people you can only yell for 10 minutes at cable TV a day, when you're stuck reading the comments online of your feed, and I don't care what your politics are. I'm a mayor who solves problems with people on both sides of the aisle. I'm somebody who brings together coalitions with my fellow mayors. If the White House withdraws from the Paris Climate Accords, we get 391 cities who say if they're out, we're in, and that's Republican and Democratic mayors together. We have to say that we have the truth, that we have goodness, and that we have our hearts. I look forward this year with the Hilton Foundation at your City Hall here in Los Angeles implementing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We have a huge sustainability plan in the city of Los Angeles that doesn't just talk about what we need to do for the environment, but what we need to do for our economy and for equity. And your generosity will allow us to make sure that we don't think that human rights just begins in other places, but that it begins right here in our backyard. That we can learn from an organization in Bangladesh as much as we can share what we've learned with them. And that we can see that the heart of humanity is bigger than anything else that is out there. So welcome home to the Hilton Humanitarian Prize. There will be surfing every year after this, so I hope that's an incentive to to keep you here. And I just want to say I'm so grateful to my father and mother who raised me with the idea that to be in the world meant to be of the world and for this world. And there's no city I'd rather be in doing that. When the International Olympic Committee awarded us just last month the Olympics, and I'm wearing the angel that will be the symbol of the next 11 years, I would challenge every Angelino to imagine the world that we want to see 11 years from now. A place of justice, a place of health, a place of opportunity, a place of true humanity, where we cross the borders not to flee, but to find one another. Thank you all so much.